Alright, let's make a burger, guys. Alright, the first thing we gotta do is set the settings. So you do this before you actually start making any art. So I've customized mine to 5,000 by 5,000 pixels so that I can make these stickers and they'll be really big and crisp and clear. So my tool of choice is the brush, and I usually will start with a blue just because in the old school animation, blue was the most common thing used for your initial animation, and since I studied a little bit of animation, I tend to go, let me use these techniques that I commonly use. So this part is just drawing. There's nothing impressive, magical, great about it, other than I just had an idea that, hey, I want to do this sort of food series for these like either stickers or t-shirts. So I want to draw them in interesting ways. So all I'm using is just, again, basic tools in Harmony. If you're not familiar with Harmony, it's a more of a vector drawing package, and I like it because of the way the tools work. So, and then you can see here, I'm just using the select tools so that I can select parts and pieces to adjust and move them around. Part of what I'm doing in here is I'm just making decisions about design-wise, like, do I have good spacing in this? Is my negative positive space working well? And is everything visually appealing? And is it clearly drawn? And then I just want to add like some little goopy bits to make that feel again a bit more visually interesting. So what I'm doing is I'm just trying to make sure that there's contrast between the elements, making sure that their textures would read relatively well without an excessive amount of detail. Offsetting things so that we get varying degrees of angles that make you bounce back and forth between the different parts of the burger, so that we don't get consistency to where everything looks and feels the same. Added a couple little drips there, just to break up the silhouette, and then I added a background because if I'm making a sticker or even like sometimes a t-shirt graphic, like I want to make it to where it's a one peel and that the little drips won't end up being like little pieces that would have to be peeled off and then stuck down separately by themselves. So that's the sort of thinking behind. Anytime I put like these little graphics behind it, that's the thinking behind it. All right, so the actual art, like cleanup making, what I usually will do is I'll take all of my drawing that was on the color layer and then I'll paste it on the line layer. Wait, it's the reverse. I'll take whatever was drawn on the line layer and paste it on the color layer, the blue part, and then I'm drawing with a red on the line layer. And if you look in the upper corner, you'll see that I switched to my cutter tool. And again, the cutter tool, if you watched any of these videos, anytime you have overlapping parts, you can then cut the parts out that you don't need. So once I'm done cleaning up, I'll then go back to that color layer and delete all the blue line. So you'll see me repeat this same step over and over again. So once again, I've taken all of the stuff that I've drawn with the blue line and I pasted it on the color layer, and now I'm drawing on my line layer. I know it sounds crazy, but that's part of why I do like to use Harmony, is because inside of every layer you actually have multiple layers. So you have a line layer, a color layer, you have an overlay, and an underlay. By default, the overlay and underlay are no longer turned on, I think because it just added more layers of confusion for people. If you go into the settings, you can turn it on. I haven't turned it on recently. I only work with the line and the color for right now, right? So this cleanup process, while this video is sped up, it is somewhat meticulous, to be fair. Again, you can see that I draw through lines a lot, and then I go back to the cutter tool and I cut them out. Sometimes I do it as I'm drawing, sometimes I'll just do it later, but 9 times out of 10 I do it while I'm drawing, primarily so I don't forget, because I know myself well enough to know that if I don't do it while I'm drawing, there's a high probability that I'll probably end up with a bunch of lines that are overlapping lines, that then I'll forget which lines were supposed to overlap and which weren't. You can see in this process that in cleaning up, that it's not left exactly like it was, that there's times where like I might go back in and remove some things or add additional details to some areas because they're not necessarily reading the way that I had intended initially. So you can see even some of the shape of that lettuce, it changed a little bit. It's not exactly the same as the original drawing. And I think it's, again, always important that anytime I'm doing any sort of drawing, art, or design, that it's always done in iterations. It's nearly impossible, at least in my opinion, to be able to work out the specifics the first time perfectly. Even sometimes that these drawings, designs, they go through like 3 or 4 iterations sometimes to make decisions about aesthetically, is that working? Are the necessary elements and details there? Is that area too busy or is it too simple? Right? So again, just zooming back out, deleting out in the color layer all the blue line art so that I can get ready to do all of my color work. For the most part, the color work does tend to be just a lot of selecting and filling things. It's not particularly difficult, but it can be time consuming if you're unsure about what you want or need to. Initially, I had considered, like, maybe I'll just draw in. I'll just pick the colors myself. But I decided, you know what? I'm just gonna go find picture reference of a burger. I'll bring in that picture reference of that burger so that I can then select my colors from there. I do recommend having some sort of basis for how you're making your decisions. I mean, it's, again, as a artist designer, it's always up to you to decide on like how you want to approach it. If you are importing things in Harmony, just make sure you don't have weird characters in the name, because I had a bunch of weird characters in there and then it gave me an error and I was like, ooh, I will punch this screen. No, I'm not that kind of person. So I just had to go back and rename it so that the file name didn't have a bunch of like characters and stuff in it, so that it would effectively import. With technology, you always run into the potential issue that there is some real tiny minutia that you may not have been aware of or thought of that's messing up your process. So always keep that in mind. So once I bring in that image, what I do is I'll turn off the animation. You can see the arrow for turning off animation. And then I'll just use that selection tool so that I can select my that layer and move it off to the side. And now all I'm doing is I'm just going to go into this color area where these palettes are. And I'm just going to keep making new ones. And I'm just using the eyedropper to select the base color for these different parts and pieces. And then I'm naming them appropriately. And usually naming them is something that just makes sense to you, or that would make sense if somebody else might have read it. If you want to get into the habit of just, good work habits, like name stuff that's reasonable, and because you always want to be considerate that at some point somebody else might be working with you. So what you'll see consistently in here is that usually the process for coloring things is relatively simple. And so I've already done the color on this background, and this is a completely separate layer. And then I make a new layer to make that white outline behind it, mostly because I like to make these little white outlines that make separation between the different layers and elements. And it creates like nice graphic quality when it sits on top of other colors, so that it becomes less problematic. So you can see I went back to my selection tool, because if you're in the cutter tool, you cannot do this convert your line art to strokes. So if you're finding that you can't convert your line art to strokes, which once you convert your line arts to strokes, you can fill to your heart's content. You can see that I had to go in and paint the little corners there. Is mostly because the line art was not completely closed, and then that little bucket fill will not fill. Even sometimes if you tell it to close gaps, it still won't fill if there's too much of a gap that it can't recognize. The color filling part is excessively fast, because all you're doing is you're in your color layer and you're just filling in those strokes. So once again, I'm just making a whole new layer and I'm just drawing around the outside so I can create like this nice little white separation line. And again, these little separation lines, all they do is just hold the overall silhouette of the entirety of your thing, so that you can create separation between different parts and pieces. So the final touch is to kind of adjust around that back plate, just to, again, create contrast. And it is important to be thinking about those sort of elements. So the fun part for some people, the more hated part for some people, is going in and faking all of this sort of shadow value work. And you'll see this is a consistent thing that I've been doing for quite some time now, where I already know the process for that. I'm going to connect nodes for the shading for this. So what I did do is I made the layer just a little less opaque so I could see through it, primarily because there's some areas that I wanted to have to go back and erase out so that I can reveal some of the stuff below. But the beauty of this is you can pick any color you want. If you watched videos before that I've done, you can see in there that I usually pick the same green just because I rarely use this green in anything. So if it's really abrasive and stands out, it's usually not a big deal. It usually doesn't cause an issue. So all I did was go back in and make it less opaque, make it 100%, less transparent, and made it 100% opaque. This is the part that usually trips people up. So when you go into your node view, your node editor, you can drag in any node. And in this case, normally what I do is I'll go into the node view, and that's on the right hand side. The left hand side is the drawing view. And then I'll just arrange around my nodes just to make them a little bit more cleaner. Now you'll see I have a tone node, and I connect that shadow layer into that tone node. And now you'll see that I got shadows, and it will cut out anything outside of the art area, right? Since that background plate is not part of that hamburger layer, you can see that it's going to cut the edges out wherever it overlaps, right? So that's part of why I really like using Harmony. Is one, when I start doing like light and shadow, I can be a little bit messy. Meaning I don't have to go right up against the edges of things. I can go past the edge and not worry about like, oh man, it's not going to be perfect. Because, sometimes if you're working like Photoshop or any other pixel-based tools, or even sometimes if you're working in like Illustrator, like you can run into that issue. Even when I connect the nodes, I can still go back in there and do some little cleanup, so you can see that I'm just, get rid of some areas in my shadow area to add a little bit of faux texture to my lettuce. That's not how you say lettuce, but I want it to sound semi-sophisticated. In my lettuce. So now I'm just going through in my shadow layer and just kind of tweaking some bits here or there. Again, the shadow area, I completely BS where the light source is coming from. The likelihood that anybody cares that it's not accurate is highly unlikely. It's really just so that it creates some degree of dimensionality to it. I went in and changed the default. So you can already see I changed the color of my lines. And you can see that went fast. The color of my lines became brown. They're no longer red. Again, if you go into your palette, you can just adjust the colors and they change with very little effort. Now I'm making another layer where I'm going to make some fake light. Sometimes I'll do the light source, sometimes I won't. But in this case, again, I usually will make some really obnoxious color that I know I'm not going to use anywhere else. And it just makes it easier for me to identify like where these light and shadow areas are. So if I ever turn off, like if I'm trying to troubleshoot, it does make my troubleshooting go faster. I usually don't have to troubleshoot as much as I used to. So I don't really necessarily need to do this. And again, I'm just making up some of this stuff because it's highly unlikely that light would penetrate some of these areas, especially like those onions under that tomato. But for the sake of giving a little bit more dimension to it, I just added it in there. And you should be conscious and aware of, like, artistically, if you decide, like, hey, I need to add some more texture here, I need to add some more dimension in there, that if you're not creating absolute realism, right, you have the flexibility to decide visually, I want to manipulate this to make it look appealing. And so all I did, again, back in that node editor, brought in this highlight node, connect that into, and usually I hold down Alt and drag and break into the line for where that node connects, and then I'll just connect that light layer into the that little black mask looking area, so that my node is now connected for my light. And you can see that I just went in and clicked the area of where that color transparency alpha area is, and I just adjusted the color of it so it was a little bit more yellow. So I use a little bit of color theory. So my shadows for this, again, the color I used was green. But inside of the node, I can actually change the actual color that shows up on the screen, because the default color is going to be like a dark gray. for the shadow, and then the default color is going to be white for the light. So I just go in there and change those colors so that it's a little bit more brilliant. And then I'll make another layer for highlights, because the rule is, it's not really a rule, but in theory, when something is done, to make it look done, you just need highlights, right? Because highlights is the last bit of, like, it's the icing on the cake. It's the final dance. It's the I'm wrapping this up. And I did duplicate the highlight and I blurred it so that it would give a little bit of a softer effect, and not just adjust the intensity of the blur so it's not over the top. And so the later stages of this, it's just tweaking. Keep in mind, the great part about this is that this is still actually vector art. So if I need to scale this up and down, I can still scale this up and down. I can also send this to other vector software by exporting it in different formats. So in that way, again, I do like to use this particular software because I get the benefit of being able to draw, but also get the benefit of being able to work in vectors, which means that I can scale these up and down to my heart's content, and they'll never lose detail or resolution. So now all I'm doing is I'm taking all of that one layer and the burger layer, I'm copying that and I'm pasting that into a new layer, and I'm mashing this all into one flat graphic shape, because what I want to do is create a gradient where there is a little bit more warmth at the bottom than at the top. And you can create a similar sort of blending mode like you would in Photoshop. So what I'm doing is I'm just making in the palette a gradient color that goes from, it's going to be the same violet on both sides of the gradient. The only difference is that on one side it's going to be transparent, so where it says alpha, I'm going to knock that all the way back down to 0. And then once I knock that down to 0 and I see, I'm going to go into that select tool and change that so it gives me the gradient editor tool. So now I can edit my gradient and reposition it wherever I want, so that I would get that transition from something that feels violet up to something transparent. So again, all that's going to do is give me just a little bit more color variation so it doesn't feel singular in color, and it's going to be visually just a little bit more appealing, right? Because sometimes if you have too much of the same, it just doesn't feel as interesting. So like adding that little bit of color variation just kind of makes it pop. At least in my mind, it makes it pop a little bit. So it's not something that you have to do. It's not a requirement. It's not like if you don't do it or so I did go in again to my node editor. I'm dragging in a blending node because I want to create again a similar approach that you would do in like either Photoshop or any other pixel based editing tool. And so you can see as it updates, as I change the different blending modes, you do have to use the little render icon in the drawing view so you can see the difference between when it's in drawing mode versus when it's giving you the render for output. And so you can see the arrow pointed that shows you where that is in the interface, so you, just in case you're unsure. And that's how you get a clear visual idea of like what the end product will look like. And it's important to check that every once in a while just to make sure that it's going the direction that you. And then after all the drawing and the manipulating, the end product is then, oh wait, reflected light. So I did say, you know what, I want to add a little reflected light because I don't want it to look singular, and I want it to look like some of the light from that little background plate bounces back up. It just adds a little more dimension, and I adjust the opacity of it so it's not as opaque. And that's strictly just to separate things so that it doesn't feel too singular in its texture. And then I'll borrow some of the color from different parts and pieces too to add that sort of sense that it's reflecting, and then fill in that white. And then again, add just a little, this is just to add a little faux drop shadowy sort of thing. So all I did was blur a version of that white background. And then I used a cutter tool to cut it so that it'll cut out the box area, so that when it gets placed on other things, that the drop shadow stuff will only sit inside the box area. It doesn't go around the outside. Because by default, if you do the blur and everything, it's going to go around the entirety. And I don't need to manually stop it. I can then just use that cutter tool that says, hey, confine it just to this box area, right? And again, nodes are super powerful. if you become comfortable using them, because you don't have to do a lot of manual labor. So that's the end product, right? So again, when I stumble upon things that might seem cool, I'll make a video for them. If you ever have questions like, hey, how'd you do that? That's crazy. Or what was that tool? You can drop those questions in the comments, and if I can answer them, I will answer them. If I don't have an answer, I'll look for an answer. I want to help you so you don't have to struggle with these tools. Support, buy some merchandise. I'm out.